Hey guys! Tonight we begin with the soft hum of distant castles, hushed corridors, and whispering tapestries. Dim your lights, loosen your shoulders, maybe pour a sip of something warm, herbal tea, not something wild, and let your mind unfurl like those tapestries in French chateaux. We're going to float through centuries of European old history, focusing not on great battles or political triumphs, but on the tragic, the odd, the quietly broken lives of royals who inherited crowns and cursed genes. Because of course, when your ancestors insist on marrying their cousins, or nieces, or uncles, you often get more than just a throne. You get weird jaws, weak bodies, melancholy, and dynastic dead ends. So let's gently ease into this world of inbreeding, dynastic mania, and the softly whispered tragedies of the elite. The dynasty that refused outsiders, hint, Habsburgs. If there is one royal family that grips our sleepy curiosity, it is the Habsburgs. They mastered power, land, diplomacy, and apparently genetic self-sabotage. Over many generations, they married close kin, double cousins, uncles to nieces, nieces to uncles. Why? To keep the land, the titles, the prestige within their extended circle. That's classic dynasty logic. But, as always, with great power comes great, genetic consequences. Geneticists and genealogists have studied them, and their inbreeding coefficient is often astonishing. Between 1450 and 1800, Habsburg marriages exhibited extremely high average relatedness. PMC +2, PubMed +2. They suffered high child mortality, miscarriages, weak offspring, and eventually the degeneration of some lines. PMC +3, PubMed +3, PubMed +3. The very features of their faces, the jutting chin, the underbite, the protruding lower lip, earned the term Habsburg Jaw, which has been traced in portraits and genealogical studies. History defined +4, Smithsonian Magazine +4, History Tools +4. Consider Charles II of Spain. He's often held up as the tragic nexus of Habsburg's self-inflicted ruin. His inbreeding coefficient is estimated at 0.254, comparable to what you might expect from children of siblings. ZME Science +4, PMC +4, PubMed +4. Because both his parents were heavily inbred themselves, the damage compounded. Smithsonian Magazine +3, PMC +3, PubMed +3. Charles was born riddled with disabilities. He had trouble articulating, eating, perhaps even basic bodily control. ZME Science +3, Smithsonian Magazine +3, PubMed +3. Some accounts say his lower and upper teeth could never touch. ZME Science +2, Smithsonian Magazine +2. He was sterile, had no heirs, and when he died, that line of the Spanish Habsburgs ended. ZME Science +3, Smithsonian Magazine +3, PubMed +3. So what does this look like in human terms? A king who couldn't chew well, couldn't father children, whose entire reign was haunted by frailty. An ultimate irony. The dynasty bent over backward to keep power inside, and ended by losing its own capacity to propagate. In portraits, contemporaries often tried to flatter him, downplay his deformities. But historians, perhaps less polite, don't hesitate to say he looked like a half-baked Habsburg potato. That's us musing, not a source quote. Yet, beyond looks, tragedy sneaked in at every level. It's not just Charles II. Earlier Habsburgs show the same pattern in smaller degrees. For example, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, had one of the highest inbreeding coefficients among emperors, approximately 0.1568 among Habsburgs. PMC +2, PubMed +2. Many of his children died young. His line strained under genetic pressure. PMC +1. When dynastic marriages repeatedly fuse the same small pool, recessive deleterious genes get revealed. That's basic genetics. Over time, you unmask rare defects. Stillbirths, childhood mortality, physical deformities. They become tragically common. The royals may ride in gilded carriages, but their bodies sometimes betray the price of exclusivity. Juana, the Mad, of Castile and the Spanish threads. Let's slide westwards to Spain. Juana of Castile, also known as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, is a figure that inevitably comes up when we talk about royal psychological collapse, though her mental health is debated. She was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. The two monarchs famously united Spain, but their children were also entangled in closeness. Ferdinand and Isabella were second cousins. Science Times +1. Juana's own life was haunted. She married Philip of Habsburg, Philip the Handsome, bridging Spanish royal blood with Habsburg genetics. Their union produced multiple children, including Charles V. But Juana is often portrayed as overly emotional, tormented, grieving deeply when her husband died, allegedly locking his coffins, wandering castles. Whether she was truly insane or just tragic is debated, but royal chronicles, always drawn to melodrama, loved the nickname. Importantly, her case shows how dynastic politics forced marriages that blended ambition with genetic risk. The royal project didn't care much if the queen developed melancholia. The treaties and claims were more vital. She also lived long in captivity, under guard by her father and then her son, sometimes locked away in relative seclusion. That sort of life, grief, powerlessness, confinement, only deepens the emotional strain. Whether mental illness was inherent or shaped by her circumstances, she becomes a somber reminder. Royals aren't immune to inner breakdown. Mariana of Austria, niece, wife and frail king. Another example that folds into both the Habsburg and Spanish spheres. Mariana of Austria. When she was a teenager, around 14, she married her uncle Philip IV of Spain, her mother's brother. Yes, niece to uncle. Royal marriages often shrank the acceptable pool dramatically. Wikipedia. She bore children, but only a few survived. Among the survivors were Charles II, our tragic king, and Margaret Theresa, who later married her maternal uncle. Yes, that pattern again. Leopold I. Wikipedia. +2. PMC. +2. Charles is often speculated to have inherited multiple recessive disorders from this close intermarriage. PMC, +3, Wikipedia, +3, PubMed, +3. He was said to be weak-headed, slow to walk or speak, physically frail. PubMed, +3, Wikipedia, +3, PMC, +3. Mariana herself ruled as regent when Philip IV died, guiding Spain through tough years, but always under the shadow of dynastic vulnerability. Mariana's case illustrates something subtle. Even though she lived under heavy dynastic pressure, she had political agency, yet her progeny was burdened with genetic debt. The crown can't always protect the body. When the handsome isn't. A small aside. Royal epithets can mislead. Many monarchs had flattering nicknames. The handsome, the great, the fair. But in many cases, the visual record, portraits, letters hint they looked quite ordinary, or worse. Philip IV of Spain, for example, painted by Velázquez with some care, reveals a seriously protruding lower jaw and lip. That Habsburg chin was already well entrenched. PubMed, +4, Smithsonian Magazine, +4, History Tools, +4. The portraits sometimes strive to smooth over or flatter, but the anatomical features remain visible. Thus, calling someone the handsome could be the court's marketing, not the genetic reality. So when you hear the handsome king, think maybe handsome by candlelight, or by some flattering painter's brush. But inside, the body and the genes often told a humbler story. Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire. Collector, melancholic, eccentric. Okay, stepping away from pure inbreeding into the realm of eccentricity. Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, late 16th, early 17th century. He's often listed among mad monarchs, though eccentric patron of the weird feels more accurate. History, +1. Rudolph withdrew from court often. He collected animals, lions, tigers, even a dodo, fossils, curiosities of all sorts. He assembled cabinets of bizarre specimens. History. He funded alchemists, astrologers, thinkers. He believed in magic, apparitions, hidden meanings. History. He'd vanish from court for weeks, speak in low voices, seem lost in his own mind. History. His reign wasn't spectacular militarily. Rather, his legacy is atmospheric. The haunted, brooding king clasping oddities in his hands. I like to imagine him drifting through Prague's dark halls, muttering to his beasts, counting stars, poking at glass jars. Not destructive, not bloodthirsty, at least not overtly, just lost in his own inward labyrinth. His personal oddities make him a kind of spiritual cousin to the inbred monarchs, royalty, but burdened with inner fissures. Charles XII of Sweden, the Spartan king who never married. Floating northward. Charles XII of Sweden, late 17th, early 18th century. He's a different brand of royal oddity. He never married. He fathered no known children. Wikipedia. Various marriage proposals failed. He apparently rejected many as unsuitable, calling one candidate as ugly as Satan with a devilish big mouth, which is blunt, but hey. Wikipedia. He was deeply devoted to military things, to his campaigns, to a life of soldiering. Wikipedia. Speculation arose over his sexuality, his reluctance to marry, his singular focus on arms over heirs. But in his case, the dysfunction is political and personal, not genetic, though the result is the same. No descendants, at least none reliably documented, and a life lived in extremity. He seems austere, resolute, almost monastic. A king who preferred war to weddings. He left behind no progeny, no dynastic threads. A royal line can fizzle that way, even without inbreeding. Overshadowed figures. The quiet sufferers. We should also breathe space for the lesser known, and more fragile, royals whose names don't echo across history but whose lives were quietly tragic. Prince Ottone of Savoy is one example. His parents were first cousins, and he suffered from physical deformities and dwarfism. Reddit. He died young. His life was short, and aside from a few scholarly mentions, few recall him. A faint, fragile life living under dynastic weight. Other Habsburg offspring, not just the crowned monarchs, often died early, miscarried, or showed abnormalities. The internal branches of the family tree bore much of the genetic toll. The nobility at large sometimes murmured about the curse of the bloodline, but official discourse seldom admitted genetic risk. Marriages were political contracts, not biology lessons. Why even royals did it, and when it backfired? You might wonder. Did any of them ever pause and think, maybe I shouldn't marry my cousin? The short answer. Rarely with enough weight to override politics. The long answer. Over time, some royal houses recognized danger and shifted strategies, especially as medical knowledge advanced in the 19th and 20th centuries. Wikipedia. +1. But for centuries, the benefits of keeping land, alliance, and prestige inside the fold seemed worth the biological risk. In some periods, marrying another royal, even if related, was considered safer diplomatically than marrying an uncertain, non-royal. Dynastic intermarriage built networks. A king in Spain might be cousin to one in Austria, linking peace or alliance. That's a side benefit. Yes, they used their genes as political glue. The Guardian. +1. But that glue often cracked the biology. By the 19th and 20th centuries, with evolving science and the decline of absolute monarchies, royals began marrying outside strict dynastic lines more often. The gene pool reluctantly opened. Wikipedia. But for the centuries before, they lived in a narrower, riskier loop. We could drift on forever through German principalities, tiny Italian duchies, and Scandinavian courts. Every branch has its share of ghost stories, tragic children, phantom lines. But let me pause here. Let your mind rest on the faces of Charles II, Juana, Rudolph, Charles XII. In the next part, we'll continue exploring more dark corners, the inbred queens, the fragile infants, and the dynastic branches that died out quietly. So, where were we? Oh right. Tiptoeing through the eerily quiet halls of Europe's royal palaces, where portraits gaze blankly, and nobody talks about how everyone was genetically related to everyone else. Tonight we keep drifting along the thread of Europe's old elite families, especially the ones whose family trees looked less like trees and more like tangled vines with too few branches. You know the type. The third cousin once removed, then re-added, kind of thing. Let's begin again with some familiar names, and some unsettling echoes. Let's revisit the Habsburg Jaw, but make it artistic. We touched on it earlier, but the Habsburg Jaw really deserves its own dreamy sidebar. It's not just a genetic curiosity, it was practically a signature feature of the family. Sculptures, coins, paintings, they all immortalize the distinctive underbite and elongated face shape. Doctors now suspect the condition was a mix of mandibular prognathism and maxillary deficiency, which is a fancy way of saying the lower jaw grew too far forward while the upper jaw didn't grow quite enough. A medical journal from 2019 confirmed this wasn't a myth. Studies of 15 royal portraits showed a correlation between inbreeding and the severity of this jawline situation. In other words, it wasn't just bad art. SmithsonianMag.com. Closing parenthesis. If you ever look at a Habsburg family portrait, especially from the Spanish line, the jaw practically jumps out at you, in a very slow, dignified way. One could call it iconic, or hereditary doom, or both. Let's glide to the Bourbons, France's answer to, "Are you okay?" The Bourbon Dynasty. Regal, grand, and occasionally just falling apart inside their wigs. One particularly interesting figure is Charles III of Spain, a Bourbon who came into power after the Spanish Habsburgs fizzled out. You might expect improvement after the genetic tangles of the Habsburgs, but not so fast. While Charles III was physically healthier than Charles II, which isn't hard, a houseplant might have been, he still wasn't exactly robust. He was, to put it gently, awkward. Described by diplomats as intelligent but withdrawn, devout but stiff, not quite the charismatic king you want on the promotional posters. His family, though, continued the tradition of dynastic cousin hopping. His son, Charles IV, married Maria Luisa of Parma, his first cousin. Because, of course, and their son, none other than Ferdinand VII, a man whose life reads like a sad opera score left out in the rain. Ferdinand VII of Spain. Royal soap opera minus the fun. Ferdinand VII is, to this day, considered one of Spain's most disastrous monarchs. Not because he was cruel or villainous. Though, okay, he wasn't winning any humanitarian awards. But because he was indecisive, reactionary, and entirely unprepared for the modern world poking at the gates. He had 4 wives, not at once, though that would be very on brand. And here's the twist. Most of them were related to him in one way or another. His first wife was his cousin. His second wife was his niece. His fourth wife, also his niece. By the time of his last marriage, he was 45 and she was 16. Charming. It gets worse. Ferdinand desperately wanted a male heir, and when his fourth wife, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, finally gave birth to a daughter, Isabella II, he changed the laws to allow a woman to inherit the throne. This enraged his brother, Don Carlos, who had been eyeing the crown himself. Thus began the Carlist Wars, a whole civil conflict sparked, in part, by the inability of this messy royal family to stop intermarrying and settle their succession like adults. So to recap: cousin-niece marriages, failed successions, civil wars, and one very tired bloodline. Isabella II. A queen, a question mark. Speaking of Isabella II, she inherited the throne as a child, ruled through adolescence, and faced criticism her entire reign for, well, almost everything. Her marriage was arranged to her cousin, Francis, Duke of Cadiz. And let's just say, this pairing wasn't exactly passionate. Francis was widely rumored to be gay or, at the very least, uninterested in women, and their marriage was said to be unconsummated for years, possibly ever. Their relationship was, by most accounts, awkward and politically motivated. Isabella had several children, but many historians suspect they weren't biologically Francis's. This didn't exactly help the monarchy's credibility. Eventually, she was forced to abdicate and spent much of her later life in exile, writing letters and reminiscing about the power that slipped away. Once again, we see a familiar royal motif: marry close relatives, suppress personal happiness, produce disputed heirs, lose the throne. Rinse, repeat. Let's gently glide to Portugal. More cousins, fewer surprises. The House of Braganza in Portugal wasn't immune to the cousin craze either. One standout case: Maria I of Portugal, also known as Maria the Pious, or, less flatteringly, Maria the Mad. Maria married her uncle, Pedro III, who co-ruled with her. Again, because why not double down on family? She had several children, but her mental health began to decline dramatically after the death of her husband and eldest son. Reports say she suffered from intense religious delusions, deep depression, and possible schizophrenia. By the early 1790s, she was declared mentally unfit to rule. Her younger son, João, took over as Prince Regent and ruled in her name. She lived for many more years, increasingly isolated, often wailing through the palace at night, according to contemporary reports. So yes, the Queen married her uncle, lost half her family, and spent her later years grieving and ghosting through the palace halls like a tragic opera character. It's all very dynastically on brand. Queen Victoria, the gene spreader. Now, no episode of Dynastic Doom would be complete without mentioning Queen Victoria. You've probably heard of her. She reigned over the British Empire at its peak, had a bunch of children, and wore black for 40 years after her husband Albert died. Romantic. Sort of. But Victoria's real legacy, in this particular discussion, is genetic. Specifically, hemophilia. Victoria was a carrier of the hemophilia B gene, which didn't show symptoms in her but was passed on to her male descendants. Hemophilia is a blood clotting disorder that, in the 19th century, was basically a death sentence if you got a paper cut. Her son Leopold inherited it and died young from a fall. Several of her grandsons and great-grandsons across Europe also carried the disease, most famously Alexei Romanov, the heir to the Russian throne. Yes, the kid Rasputin was always trying to heal. The condition spread through royal houses like the world's worst party favor. Victoria's daughters married into the houses of Spain, Germany, and Russia, and with them came this rather fatal souvenir. Even the Spanish royal line ended up with hemophiliac heirs, some of whom died young or suffered for decades. It's fascinating, really. Victoria's role in spreading this disorder was entirely accidental. She likely got the mutation spontaneously. No known family history before her. And it quietly made its way across the continent, one arranged marriage at a time. The Romanovs. Glamorous, cursed, and crumbling. Speaking of Alexei Romanov, his short and painful life is a symbol of just how fragile royal glory could be. Born to Tsar Nicholas II and Alexandra Feodorovna, who was, of course, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, Alexei was the long-awaited male heir to the Russian throne. But almost immediately, it became clear something was wrong. He bruised easily, bled without clotting. His hemophilia was kept secret for years, not exactly ideal for the stability of an empire on the verge of collapse. His suffering was constant, and his mother clung to spiritual figures like Rasputin, believing he had the power to stop the boy's bleeding. It was all very mystical and tragic and, in the end, futile. Alexei's illness undermined the public's faith in the Romanovs. Whispers of weakness, divine punishment, and royal doom swirled like fog around the palace. And then, the Bolsheviks came. But we won't go there tonight. That's a bit loud for this hour. Instead, we can just rest in the knowledge that the little boy who symbolized imperial hope was quietly undone by a gene passed down from a queen who loved black lace and family portraits. So, we just left off in France. The Bourbons had staged their return after that whole head-losing incident in the French Revolution, and for a while, it seemed like royal business might resume as usual. You know, powdered wigs, cousin marriages, quiet child funerals. That kind of party. But even in their restoration, things didn't exactly bounce back. Louis XVIII and Charles X. The restoration that wasn't. Let's start with Louis XVIII, the brother of the beheaded Louis XVI. Louis XVIII became king after Napoleon's little European joyride ended. But Louis wasn't exactly what you'd call an inspiring comeback story. He was obese, gout-ridden, and chronically ill. He also hadn't been in France for over 2 decades, which didn't help him connect with the whole post-guillotine crowd. He had no children. Just aches, regrets, and very tight shoes. So when he died in 1824, the throne passed to his brother, Charles X, who, and we say this gently, completely misread the room. Charles tried to rewind France to the good old days. Nobility, divine right, censorship. Because what better way to win back the people than to undo the revolution they just had? This, of course, went down like spoiled wine, and Charles X was booted out after just 6 years. He spent his twilight years in exile, presumably staring into the middle distance and wondering what went wrong. Spoiler. Almost everything. Louis Philippe, the bourgeois king, with a slight identity crisis. Then came Louis Philippe, the so-called citizen king. He tried to seem relatable, wore simple clothes, walked around Paris like a humble guy. He was from the House of Orléans, a cadet branch of the Bourbons, which meant he had just enough royal blood to be technically legitimate and just enough baggage to keep things awkward. Now, Louis Philippe actually tried marrying outside the family, somewhat. His wife, Maria Amalia of Naples and Sicily, was still a Bourbon, though from a slightly different angle of the family triangle. They had 10 children, several of whom married cousins obviously, and the genetic roulette continued. Still, Louis Philippe was, in some ways, a soft reformer, until he wasn't. By 1848, after years of economic issues and social unrest, he was overthrown too. That's 2 Bourbon collapses in 1 century, if you're keeping score. He fled to England, where he died peacefully, a quiet end for a man whose reign had all the enthusiasm of a lukewarm bath. Let's drip down to Bavaria. Castles, cousins, and lonely kings. It's time to float to Germany, or rather, the patchwork of German kingdoms that existed before unification. Specifically, let's tuck ourselves into Bavaria. Because this is where we find one of history's dreamiest, most impractical royals, Ludwig II of Bavaria. You've probably seen his work, Neuschwanstein Castle. The fairy tale one. The one that inspired Disney's logo. Ludwig commissioned it, designed it, obsessed over it, and rarely finished anything. Ludwig II of Bavaria. The mad king who just wanted a castle. Ludwig became king at 18, and to his credit, he did try to rule. But he didn't really like it. Court life bored him. Politics stressed him out. What he really loved was art, music, poetry, and Richard Wagner. Oh, Wagner. Ludwig funded Wagner's operas obsessively, built lavish theaters, and wrote adoring letters. He also designed castles, dozens of them. He poured public money into stone towers and swan statues while Bavaria teetered on economic instability. He never married. An engagement was announced once, to his cousin Duchess Sophie Charlotte, but it was quickly called off. Some say Ludwig was gay, others say he was just wildly uninterested in romance. Either way, he died childless, alone, and surrounded by his unfinished fantasies. In 1886, Ludwig was declared insane by the state, deposed, and placed under house arrest. Days later, he was found dead in a shallow lake under mysterious circumstances, alongside his psychiatrist. Officially, it was suicide. Unofficially, let's not speculate tonight. That's a story for louder hours. All we need to know is that his castles remain beautiful, empty, expensive, and sad. Just like the man who built them. More Bavarian sadness. Otto, the other one. Did you think Bavaria was done? Not quite. Ludwig's cousin, Otto I, technically succeeded him. But Otto had already been declared insane years before. His condition, likely schizophrenia, kept him out of public life, so a regency was declared. He spent his life confined, quiet, and fading. He reigned in name only for 30 years, a king on paper, a ghost in reality. So, to sum up, 2 kings. One obsessed with fantasy. One lost in delusion. Neither truly ruled. It was like Bavaria was allergic to functioning monarchs. Leopold II of Belgium. Shish. Just don't look too closely. Now, let's glide very carefully to Belgium. Because while this isn't a horror story tonight, we can't talk royal dysfunction without at least whispering about Leopold II. Officially, he was king of the Belgians. Unofficially, he ruled over the Congo Free State, a private colony he controlled personally. That's right. He wasn't just king. He was the sole owner of 76 times the landmass of Belgium. Leopold claimed it was humanitarian. It was, in reality, something else entirely. But we're not going to dig too deep tonight. That gets dark, and we're here for soft royal dysfunction, not colonial atrocities. Let's just say Leopold had a lot of children, some legitimate, some very not, and by the time of his death, he was more or less estranged from his surviving daughters. He left most of his fortune to his mistress. Of course he did. As for heirs, his legitimate son died young. That's often how these things go. Belgian side note. So many cousins, so little joy. In true royal fashion, Leopold II had married his cousin, Marie Henriette of Austria, a Habsburg, because even when the bloodline goes west, it never really escapes the chin. Their marriage was deeply unhappy. He called her the ugliest woman in Europe, which, even by 19th century standards, was unnecessarily rude. She, in turn, avoided him as much as possible. Their daughter, Princess Louise, eventually scandalized Europe by having multiple affairs, running off, and being institutionalized. At a certain point, you stop being surprised and just start nodding slowly. Ah, yes. Another royal family, quietly unraveling. The Austrian emperor who just wanted a nap. Speaking of the Habsburgs, again, let's visit Franz Joseph I of Austria, ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for over 60 years. He wasn't scandalous. He wasn't eccentric. He was tired. Always tired. Franz Joseph lived through everything. Revolutions, wars, assassinations. And behind that well-groomed mustache was a man who never really wanted to be emperor, but just kept going out of obligation. His wife, Empress Elizabeth, better known as Sisi, was a beauty icon, traveler, and emotional free spirit who absolutely hated the rigidity of court life. She and Franz Joseph spent most of their marriage apart, emotionally and physically. Their only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in the infamous Mayerling incident, a suspected suicide pact with his young mistress. This shattered the imperial family. So, no heir, no joy, just Franz Joseph, alone again, staring out the window of Schönbrunn Palace, wondering how things got so bleak. Empress Sisi. Royal life, but make it sad. A quick whisper about Empress Sisi, since she's too iconic to skip. She was forced into marriage at 15, became empress at 16, and never really adjusted. She hated the court, avoided Vienna, and wandered Europe endlessly. Her health obsessions, her strict diets, her melancholy poetry, all signs of someone trying to escape a life she never wanted. She was eventually assassinated in Geneva by an anarchist who didn't even know who she was. Just stabbed the first royal-looking lady he saw. The irony. Her tight corset kept her alive for hours, sealing the wound until it was too late to fix. Even her death felt like a symbol of her life. tightly laced, quietly tragic. We're slipping back into Austria-Hungary, because honestly, that empire was just loaded with fragile aristocrats trying to hold it together with epaulets and tragic correspondence. So far, we've met Ludwig the castle builder, Sisi the royal runaway, and Franz Joseph, the grandfather of European existential crisis. But don't worry, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a gift that just kept on emotionally imploding. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a man who was never supposed to matter. We all know the name Franz Ferdinand, mostly because of that assassination in Sarajevo. But before he got shot in a car, he lived a quietly awkward life, being mildly disliked by almost everyone. Franz Ferdinand wasn't the original heir. He only became crown prince because Emperor Franz Joseph's son, Rudolf, died in that messy Mayerling scandal. And then Rudolf's uncle died. And then someone else died. And eventually, Franz Ferdinand was next in line, kind of by default. He was deeply conservative, extremely Catholic, and had no patience for court politics. Naturally, everyone at court resented him. And then he went and married Sophie Chotek, who wasn't royal enough by Habsburg standards. Cue the pearl clutching. Franz Joseph, who could hold a grudge longer than a marble statue, refused to attend their wedding. He allowed the marriage, but only if it was morganatic, meaning Sophie and their children wouldn't inherit anything. So, they lived in a strange half-life, royal, but not too royal. Allowed to attend functions, but seated awkwardly near the potted plants. It was like being invited to a party where you have to use the servant's entrance. Every time. Franz Ferdinand adored Sophie, though. He doted on her, traveled with her, refused to play politics if she wasn't included. Which makes it all the more tragic that she died next to him in that Sarajevo motorcade, the one with the famously bad route planning. But that's stories for another kind of podcast. We're just here to note. Franz Ferdinand was a man born into power he didn't want, in a family that didn't want him, heading toward a death that would accidentally start a world war. Quietly, tragically, inevitably, the Hohenzollerns, Prussia's favorite control freaks. Let's float north to the Hohenzollerns, the ruling family of Prussia and, later, the German Empire. These were not your sensitive, castle-building types. They were rigid, militaristic, and emotionally constipated in truly Prussian fashion. Enter Kaiser Wilhelm II, the last emperor of Germany. Now, Wilhelm is an entire dissertation of dysfunction. Born with a withered left arm due to a botched delivery, he spent his life overcompensating. His mother, Victoria, yes, daughter of that Queen Victoria, was cold, ambitious, and utterly disappointed in him from the moment he could hold a teacup with one hand. Wilhelm admired the military, detested diplomacy, and had a tendency to say the wrong thing at state dinners, often loudly, and in multiple languages. He idolized his grandfather, Wilhelm I, who was stoic and bearded and safely dead. But Wilhelm's real nemesis was his own mother, who wanted a liberal, enlightened Germany. Instead, she got Wilhelm, who enjoyed parades and yelling. As emperor, he constantly fired competent ministers, got jealous of other monarchs, and casually ruined alliances. He wanted to be both loved and feared, but mostly ended up resented. Under his rule, Germany drifted into World War I, and after losing, Wilhelm fled to the Netherlands and spent the rest of his life in exile, chopping wood and sulking about democracy. No, really. He took up woodcutting. It was very on brand. So, to recap: overbearing mother, war-hungry child, crumbling empire. Nothing new here. Just another royal with a complicated relationship with literally everything. Victoria's grandchildren. The world's saddest family reunion. We need to talk more about Queen Victoria's genetic legacy. She didn't just pass on hemophilia, she also passed on herself. By the late 1800s, Victoria had basically infiltrated every royal family in Europe. Her children married into Germany, Russia, Spain, Sweden, and Norway. Which means by the time World War I broke out, all the major rulers were related. Kaiser Wilhelm II was her grandson. King George V of Britain was her grandson. Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, also a granddaughter. You see where this is going. In theory, it could have been one big family meeting with tea and awkward silences. In practice, it was a global war between cousins, each with slightly different mustaches and extremely inherited trauma. And speaking of Tsarina Alexandra, Alexandra Feodorovna. From English Rose to Russian Tragedy, Alexandra was born Alex of Hesse, a German princess and Queen Victoria's favorite granddaughter. She was thoughtful, shy, intensely religious. And when she married Nicholas II of Russia, she found herself woefully unprepared for the weight of the Russian throne. Her marriage to Nicholas was a genuine love match, which, as you may have noticed by now, is rare and usually doomed in royal history. She bore him 5 children, the last of whom was Alexei, the hemophiliac heir we mentioned earlier. Alexandra blamed herself for his condition. She saw it as divine punishment. Desperate for a cure, she turned to mystics, most famously Rasputin, the bearded enigma who shuffled into their lives and never left. Her obsession with Rasputin, her German heritage, and her introverted nature made her wildly unpopular with the Russian people. By the time revolution knocked at the palace gates, she was already mentally checked out, exhausted, isolated, and in mourning for the country that was slipping through her fingers. She died with her family in a basement, far from court, far from power. It was a brutal end, and far too loud for tonight's tone, so we'll just linger a bit longer in her quieter years, where the palace halls were dark, the air thick with candle smoke, and the only comfort was a stranger who claimed he could heal. Let's whisper about Sweden. The Bernadottes begin. Need a gentle palate cleanser? Let's take a sleepy little detour to Sweden, where royal chaos came with fewer public decapitations. The House of Bernadotte began in the early 1800s, oddly enough, with a French general. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte was a soldier under Napoleon, who somehow became King Charles XIV John of Sweden because Europe was in one of those moods. He didn't even speak Swedish at first, which made state dinners a bit quiet. But he adapted. His descendants, the Bernadottes, have ruled Sweden ever since. And while they avoided most of the classic cousin marriage traps, they weren't entirely free of sadness. For example, Prince Gustav Adolf, heir to the throne in the 1940s, died in a mysterious plane crash, leaving behind a young son, Carl Gustaf, now Sweden's current king. Swedish royalty, though calmer, still carried that royal recipe: early deaths, strained duty, and a mild allergy to emotional expression. Back to the Windsors. Dysfunction, modernized. Of course, no bedtime binge through royal history is complete without returning, one last time, to the British royal family. Formerly Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Then Windsor. Because World War I made German-sounding names very unfashionable. George V, during the war, rebranded the family with something a little more locally sourced. Thus, Windsor. Like the castle. Very patriotic. Very convenient. George V was serious, stiff, and pathologically opposed to emotion. His children didn't fare much better. Edward VIII, his eldest son, abdicated the throne for love, a twice-divorced American woman named Wallis Simpson. Scandalous, obviously, but also a relief to everyone who thought he was unfit to rule. Which was basically everyone. His brother, George VI, became king instead, reluctantly. A shy man with a stammer, he was never meant to wear the crown. But he did. And he carried Britain through World War II with a quiet resolve that nearly made up for the fact that his entire family line was stitched together with worry. George VI's daughter, Elizabeth II, inherited the throne in 1952 and reigned for 70 years. Calm, distant, relentlessly composed. It's hard to say how much of that was personality, and how much was generational trauma, carefully ironed and worn like a brooch. And even in modern times, marriages fell apart, siblings feuded, and the institution carried on, like a slightly dented porcelain teapot no one's allowed to throw out. Let's rest here for a moment, in the dim corridors of Windsor Castle, where the ghosts of Queen Victoria's expectations still hover gently behind the drapes. In the next part, we'll wind down with a few more whisper-worthy dynasties: the Dutch, the Danes, the barely functioning micro-monarchies of Europe. Just a few more fading crowns, before we let the candles burn out. You're nearly there. Let's drift now to the Netherlands, where tulips bloom, canals meander, and the House of Orange Nassau gently reigns, occasionally wearing very orange outfits. Now, the Dutch monarchy doesn't often get the flashy drama of the Habsburgs or Romanovs, but they've had their share of slow-burning dysfunction. It's all just been very polite. Which somehow makes it even sadder. King William III. Not exactly a people person. Let's start with King William III of the Netherlands. Not the English one. That was a different William III, same number, more wigs. We're talking about the Dutch king who reigned from 1849 to 1890. William was tall, stern, and, according to those who knew him, frequently angry. His contemporaries nicknamed him King Gorilla, which feels harsh, but also weirdly accurate. He was known for temper tantrums, distrust of parliament, and a complete inability to connect with people. His first wife, Queen Sophie, was an intellectual and a pacifist. She found William unbearable. They lived in separate wings of the palace, communicated through letters, and spent most of their time not seeing each other. Their only surviving son, William, Prince of Orange, was supposed to inherit the throne, but he died of typhus after years of drinking, brooding, and possibly waiting to be allowed to marry a Belgian countess. He was 38. His nickname, Wee Wheel. Yes, really. So, with no heirs left, William III, at age 61, decided to marry again. This time, he picked Emma of Waldeck and Pyrmont, who was 20. You can do the math on that one, but suffice it to say the vibe was unbalanced. Still, she gave birth to their only child, Wilhelmina, who became queen at age 10, after William finally shuffled off. Emma acted as regent, and to her credit, she held things together with a lot of quiet dignity, patience, and probably a daily cry in a very regal chair. Queen Wilhelmina, the longest serving, least amused. Wilhelmina reigned for 58 years. She watched 2 world wars go by, survived exile in London, and never quite smiled. At least not in photos. She had a steel spine, a deep religious streak, and a personal motto that translates loosely to, "I will maintain." And maintain she did. Her daughter, Juliana, was less formal, more approachable, and definitely more emotional. She once took a deep interest in spiritualism and followed a faith healer named Greet Hofmans. This caused quite the scandal. Not loud, but embarrassing in a quiet Dutch sort of way. You know it's bad when your royal advisors start panicking about seances. Still, Juliana ruled with relative calm and later abdicated in favor of her daughter Beatrix, who ruled until 2013, then passed the crown to her son, King Willem-Alexander, the first male Dutch monarch in over a century. They're still around, the House of Orange. Smiling, waving, wearing bright colors. But somewhere deep in the family archive, there's still that bitter letter from Queen Sophie complaining about King Gorilla's latest mood swing. Meanwhile, in Denmark, oldest monarchy, same sadness. Let's drift a bit northeast to Denmark, one of the oldest monarchies in the world, still running, still smiling politely from balconies. The Danish royal family has a reputation for being surprisingly functional. But don't worry, they've had their gloomy chapters, too. Christian VII. King in name, drama in practice. In the late 1700s, King Christian VII came to the throne. He was mentally ill from a young age, possibly schizophrenia, possibly something undiagnosed and untreated. What we do know is that he was erratic, often incoherent, and entirely unsuited to rule. His court tried to manage things by surrounding him with advisors, including a German doctor named Johann Strunzi, who ended up effectively running the country. Oh, and also having an affair with the Queen. That Queen, Caroline Matilda, was British, the sister of King George III. She was young, bright, and completely unprepared for a husband who had trouble functioning in a court full of whispers. She fell in love with Strunzi, and for a while, it seemed like they were running Denmark together, reforming things, publishing laws, and raising the king's son like a happy little modern family. Of course, it didn't last. The court turned on them. Strunzi was executed, Caroline was exiled, and Christian VII went back to wandering palace halls, talking to shadows. He technically reigned for decades more, but power was never really his again. Another monarch who just existed. Crown on his head, nothing behind his eyes. Let's drift briefly into Norway. Spare royals and spare time. Norway didn't have its own monarchy for much of the 19th century. It was in a union with Sweden, then broke off in 1905 and asked Prince Karl of Denmark to become King Haakon VII. He accepted, changed his name, and brought his little son, Olav, with him. The Norwegians liked him, mostly because he showed up and didn't ruin anything. Haakon ruled through both world wars, spending time in exile during the Nazi occupation. When he came back, he was greeted with cheers and flags, which, for Norway, is the equivalent of screaming in joy. His descendants have continued the line, and it's all relatively quiet. Scandals exist, usually in the form of someone marrying a commoner or wearing an outfit too sparkly. But compared to the jawlines and regencies of elsewhere, Norway is positively zen. Liechtenstein. Small country, large wealth, minimal meltdowns. We'll take a very soft detour here to Liechtenstein, that postage stamp principality wedged between Switzerland and Austria. The ruling family, the House of Liechtenstein, is wealthy, discreet, and has been very careful not to cause international incidents. There are no cousin marriages in recent memory. No tragic heirs. No castles full of mournful whispers. Just a very, very rich family living in a tax haven. Honestly, it's a little disappointing. But also, good for them. Monaco. The glittering, gambling exception. Then there's Monaco, which feels like royal family fanfiction that got out of hand. The House of Grimaldi is one of Europe's oldest dynasties, and definitely one of its messiest. For centuries, they were known for bankruptcies, mistresses, and occasional piracy. Things stabilized a bit in the 20th century when Prince Rainier III married Grace Kelly, a literal Hollywood actress, because subtlety was never Monaco's strong suit. Grace became Princess Grace, and for a while, they seemed like a fairy tale. But Monaco never lets things stay simple. Their children, especially Princess Stephanie and Princess Caroline, were tabloid magnets. Affairs, modeling, breakups, and more than a few poor driving decisions followed. Grace herself died tragically in a car crash in 1982. A quiet, winding road, a missed turn, and that was it. Rainier never recovered. He ruled until his death in 2005, and their son Albert II took over. Albert has children. Some of them are legitimate. Some arrived earlier. It's Monaco. You get what you pay for. Let's pause again. Just for a moment. We've traveled through crumbling empires, doomed heirs, and marble-floored courts filled with melancholy. Through cousins who shouldn't have married and thrones that probably shouldn't have existed. And yet, here we are, centuries later, still whispering their names. In the final part, we'll bring it all together. A gentle conclusion, a few last crown-shaped oddities, and the softest royal goodnight. By now we've visited empires that collapsed under their own inbreeding, kings who ruled from padded rooms, and queens who'd rather be anywhere else. So to close things off, we'll glance at a few final dynasties, still standing, barely breathing, or long since swept into the footnotes. Because even after the revolutions, abdications, and constitutional rewrites, some monarchs just won't leave. The Romanian royals, of exile and forgotten sashes. Let's start with Romania, whose monarchy was a borrowed one from the start. In 1866, Romania, still relatively new as a unified country, imported Carol I, a German prince from the House of Hohenzollern, because nothing says national pride like asking Prussia for help. Carol I ruled capably, established a kingdom, and built Pélé's castle, which honestly looks like it belongs in a Tolkien novel. So, points for that. His descendants, though, had difficulties. The main one, Carol II, king in the interwar years, known mostly for chaos and an unhealthy love life. He abdicated once, came back, married a commoner, took multiple mistresses, and generally treated the crown like a mildly inconvenient accessory. He was eventually pushed out in favor of his son, Michael I, who was just a child. Michael ruled twice, first as a puppet king during World War II, then again until 1947, when the communists politely told him to leave, or else. Michael was the last king of Romania. He spent most of his life in exile, quietly gardening and avoiding scandal. He died in 2017, having outlived nearly every European monarch who'd ever heard his name. Bulgaria. The king who came back as prime minister. And speaking of unlikely royal careers, meet Simeon II of Bulgaria, a boy king who was exiled at age 6 when the monarchy was abolished. He spent decades abroad, studied in Madrid, got into business, wore nice suits. Then, in a plot twist no one asked for, he returned to Bulgaria in the early 2000s, and became prime minister. Yes, he wasn't restored as king. He just ran for office. And won. Because why not? It's probably the only time in modern history that a former monarch ran a country as a commoner. And in a democracy, no less. He didn't do a terrible job. But he also didn't last long. Bulgaria moved on. Again. Simeon still lives in Sofia, technically still a king, just one that nobody works for. Greece. Royals without a throne or passport. Let's float over to Greece, which had a monarchy, then didn't, then did again, and then, definitely didn't. The Greek royal family also came imported, from Denmark, of all places. King George I of Greece was originally Prince William of Denmark, plucked from a spare drawer of the Danish royal family and offered the crown in 1863. He ruled for decades, and his descendants married into every major royal house, because of course they did. Then came Constantine II, the last king. He reigned from 1964 to 1973, a time of coups, chaos, and intense political instability. Eventually, he was exiled, stripped of his citizenship, and told not to come back. He lived in London for decades, mostly being confused for a tennis coach. In the early 2000s, he returned to Greece briefly, now just a private citizen with a royal sense of posture. He died in 2023. The monarchy is gone. The family still exists, mostly on Instagram, sharing black and white portraits and polite captions. Albania. Just don't ask. Albania's monarchy barely even happened. In 1928, King Zog I declared himself monarch after serving as president. No royal lineage, no bloodline, just pure Balkan audacity. He ruled for 11 years, drank 20 cups of coffee a day, allegedly survived over 50 assassination attempts, and fled when Italy invaded in 1939. He took most of the crown jewels with him and lived the rest of his life in exile, occasionally reminding people that, yes, he used to be king. His descendants still use titles like prince and crown princess, though they reign over exactly 0 subjects. Still, you've got to respect the energy. Portugal. Monarchists without a country. Portugal abolished its monarchy in 1910, with minimal fuss, actually. The last king, Manuel II, was young, unmarried, and deeply unprepared for revolution. He spent his exile in England, collecting books, avoiding attention, and dying quietly of a throat infection. His family line technically ended with him, but several branches of the House of Braganza still claim the throne. As of now, the most prominent is Dom Duarte Paio, a man who wears suits well, speaks gently, and is technically the pretender to the Portuguese throne, even though most Portuguese people would prefer a public tram to a coronation. Still, he's out there. Occasionally giving speeches. Occasionally attending weddings. Mostly existing in a sort of polite historical blur. And finally, the Windsors again, just because. Yes, we already whispered about the Windsors. But let's close with them, because like a very long-running period drama, they're still going. Still waving. Still making headlines even when they try not to. After Elizabeth II's record-breaking reign, Charles III now wears the crown. Technically, emotionally, he seems more like a museum curator who keeps trying to get guests to appreciate an 18th-century inkwell. He waited longer than any heir in British history. Married Diana. Divorced Diana. Married Camilla. Became king at 73, which is like starting a new job the day you should have retired. His reign is likely to be quiet, short, and full of climate change speeches. And behind him stands William, Prince of Wales, who seems to be balancing royal duty with just enough visible discomfort. He'll inherit it all eventually. The palaces, the constitutional headaches, and the centuries of drama tied up in a very expensive crown. And then there's Harry, who, well, you already know. That's another bedtime story. So where does that leave us? After 6 parts and many yawns, here we are, at the edge of Europe's long royal twilight. Some monarchies still stand. Others faded quietly, like candles in a cold chapel. And most of the families, even the ones without thrones, still exist. They go to galas. They pose in sashes. They name their children things like Leopold and Maria Theresa, even though they mostly answer to their PR agents. Royalty, as an institution, has never really been about governance. Not really. It's about symbolism, performance, continuity, and, as you've probably noticed, dysfunction. So many kings and queens. So many dynasties too tangled to chart without graph paper. So many tragic heirs who were too sick, too sad, too inbred, or just born at the wrong time. And yet, here we are, still talking about them. Still looking at their portraits. Still, somehow, falling asleep to the soft murmur of their family trees. So go ahead. Let the final crown slip into velvet silence. You've earned it. Good night.